Real Stories Tapes True Crime is your new true crime podcast fix. In our first season, we'll explore suspicious deaths at a California hospital and a skydiver landing dead on a suburban driveway with a bag containing guns, drugs, and night vision goggles. To join our investigation, search and subscribe to Real Stories Tapes True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.
What should have been the relaxing end to a balmy day along the Egyptian Nile became a hellish nightmare for one innocent businesswoman when pathological liar John Allen was intent on her murder.
John Allen had the classic sociopathic tendencies.
It was sinister because there'd been a long run up to it. What better than doing it in Egypt with all the heat?
In the early 1990s, the daughter of a Welsh lawyer, Cheryl Lewis became one of the first women in the Liverpool area to set up her own solicitor practice. Father of three, John Allen, was one of her clients.
He was a graduate in applied chemistry. His first wife was a fellow chemistry student. And when they graduated, they moved to Zambia, to Chingola province. He was working in copper mining. His second wife was an Iranian national. They created a printing business in the Birkenhead area, and that marriage lasted for some 14 years before his wife learned of his relationship with Cheryl Lewis.
Cheryl Lewis and John Allen had parted from their respective spouses. By 1993, he had moved in with Cheryl and into her comfortable Oxton home.
He was incredibly attentive to Cheryl, who had a busy job. In fact, it was almost like their roles were reversed. He was almost like the housewife back, having lovely meals waiting for her when she came home.
John Allen became financially dependent upon Cheryl Lewis. He lived in her home, he had the use of her car, and she paid effectively for all of their pleasures.
Though without children of her own, Cheryl had nieces and nephews. And having amassed business interests and personal assets, she wrote a will.
She was not leaving anything to him at all.
Over the ensuing years, Cheryl's father was mystified by his daughter's relationship with Allen. In 1997, that turned to dismay when a bizarre episode followed the couple's holiday to Wales.
The first clue as to John Allen's intentions came when he and Cheryl went on a holiday in Wales, and Cheryl's topaz ring, worth thousands of pounds, went missing. And even more bizarrely, shortly after the ring went missing, a ransom letter was sent to Cheryl demanding thousands of pounds in exchange for getting the ring back. Cheryl then paid the ransom for the ring and got her ring back.
The ring was of great sentimental value to Cheryl, as it was left to her by her mother. So Cheryl wanted it back the easiest way possible, not suspecting who the money was really going to. Unperturbed, the couple planned another holiday, this time further afield.
Of course, their holiday in Egypt he had suggested and pushed for, but in fact, he had another reason for wanting to go on holiday with her to Egypt.
John Allen wasn't planning a holiday. He was planning Cheryl's murder. His weapon? Cyanide. His motive? To inherit Cheryl's wealth.
When he worked in copper mining in Chingola province in Zambia, he had a little hobby of collecting butterflies. And how did he kill them? He killed them with cyanide.
The sodium cyanide isn't toxic until it reaches the stomach. When it reaches the stomach, it combines with the hydrochloric acid to produce hydrocyanic acid, which in fact is poisonous.
In October 1998, John and Cheryl arrived in Luxor and checked into room 508 at the Winter Palace Hotel. On their 6th night, Cheryl emerged from the bathroom. Alan presented her with a drink.
John Allen had made a nightcap for his girlfriend and put an amount of sodium cyanide in her gin and tonic. She'd drunk this completely unawares.
Cyanide possesses a distinct smell of almonds, but many people can't detect it.
40% of people couldn't smell cyanide in any event. And on that topic, it was worthy of note that Cheryl Lewis had been involved in a road traffic accident sometime before all of this, that she'd sustained some facial injuries and she had lost her sense of smell. Doubtless this was known to John Allen.
As the agonizing effects of the poison gripped Cheryl, Alan waited before leaving the room to seek help.
John Allen emerged from the lift in the foyer and indicated to those present, one of whom was a former airline stewardess, that there was a problem with Cheryl Lewis in their room, number 508.
Someone suggested that she be given mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which he refused because he must have known that coming out of her mouth would be deadly cyanide fumes.
She would have intense pain in her stomach. And then, as the cyanide became involved with her red blood cells, she would get symptoms of asphyxia, fighting for her breath, and accumulation of fluid in her lungs. The reason she had froth in her mouth was that she had fluid in her airways, and that, in fact, as the gasping for breath, the fluid comes into the mouth.
There is internal violence to the body here that's very dramatic, very painful. And to someone who knows what the action of that poison is going to be, it's almost like physical shooting or stabbing, but it's happening inside the victim.
Cheryl was taken to the local hospital, but was soon pronounced dead. With her death, John Allen began weaving his web of lies.
The story given was that they'd both been out for a meal and then returned, and she had decided to go for a walk. But then he found her later in a collapsed state in their room.
So when he was asked to account for Cheryl's death, he was saying that he'd been a spy and possibly some other spies who hated him might have killed her. He'd been a mercenary. There may be somebody connected with his mercenary life that had killed her. So all these very bizarre stories. And it just drew more and more attention to him and made his accounts less and less believable.
He didn't stay in Egypt, but left as quickly as he could after Cheryl's death. When the news of Cheryl's fate reached her family, they were shocked. Her father, Eric, was not just distraught, but highly suspicious of Alan.
Eric Lewis was dubious about the nature of his daughter's death. The death certificate issued by the authorities in Egypt stated that the cause of death was heart and circulatory failure and acute coronary thrombosis. But there was no history of any heart condition. No post-mortem examination had been carried out in Egypt.
That changed as soon as Cheryl's body arrived back in England.
I was asked to do a post-mortem because she died abroad. I don't think he was aware of the fact that the coroner would automatically ask for a post-mortem when the body was brought back.
What Dr. Tapp discovered was alarming.
The skin was bluish, and that's caused by lack of oxygen shortly before she died. And we know from what the people at Luxor said, she was gasping for breath. There was a lot of damage to the lining of the stomach, which suggested a corrosive of some sort. The mouth and gullet weren't affected, which suggested that it was something which had been released in the stomach which had caused the corrosion. Because if you swallow some caustic soda or some hydrochloric acid, you will get damage all the way from your mouth down into your stomach. And this is fairly classical of cyanide poisoning.
But proving Cheryl had died from cyanide poisoning would be harder.
One of the problems that made it more difficult for us was the fact that while she was in Egypt, she was embalmed. The embalming causes problems with the interpretation of the analysis of the tissues and the blood. And if you're looking for poisoning, as we were in this case, it can interfere with that by making the results distorted.
First of all, we had to prove that it was a cyanide poisoning, and then secondly, we had to dispel this myth that it was intended for him.
While the cause of death was inconclusive, police were keen to have a chat with Alan.
John Allen was spoken to by the police at a relatively early stage. He said, I could drop myself in the shit now. I'm an applied chemist, chemical engineer. I could have given her something and I'd know what to give her so that it wouldn't be found, wouldn't I?
He believed he was so clever, so invincible, and so artful that no one would work out what he'd been doing.
John Allen was doing little to disguise his malignant narcissism, and even less to disguise his lust for largesse. From luxury cars to expensive jewellery, he was back to his old tricks of shamelessly stealing from Cheryl.
Eric Lewis wanted to know just what had become of items of her jewellery which had gone missing, items that she'd actually taken with her on the holiday and had been left to her by her late mother.
Devoid of conscience, but brimming with greed, John Allen had sold the cherished heirlooms of Cheryl's late mother.
Following his return to England, a number of days later, he went along to a jeweller's in Chester, and he there sold a number of items of jewellery, a 5-stone diamond ring, a solitaire, and 2 bracelets. The 5-stone diamond ring was then sold by that jeweller to another jeweller in Hatton Garden, and then on to a jeweller in Bath. Eventually, it was recovered from that jeweller. It was identified as being that of Cheryl Lewis, and all of this was clearly traceable back to John Allen.
Allen's so-called cunning was becoming clumsy. When Eric was presented with Cheryl's will, Allen had gifted investigators with yet more evidence for a motive.
He'd forged Cheryl's will. She'd left an estate of around £400,000, and that had been altered to be completely in his favour. And when her family found this out, they just thought that was highly unusual and completely unsuspected.
In altering the wording of the will, he had used language which was not legalistic. It was not the work of a solicitor. It was an amateur's work. He had misspelled her name. Her middle name was Leslie, and he had misspelled that L-E-S-L-I-E, not L-E-S-L-E-Y. And rather curiously, he was in the habit of misspelling his own middle name. On his birth certificate, he was John Frederick Allen, F-R-E-D-E-R-I-C-K, but he was in the habit of stating his middle name to be Frederick, F-R-E-D-R-I-C-K, and he'd done so in the will.
Police discovered yet more incriminating evidence when they searched the house.
A whole lot of floppy disks were found at the house where they'd been living, and one of those contained 3 different practice attempts by him at forging the will. And so, putting all of this together, here we had a motive, a financial motive for the killing, and clearly it was to get his hands upon everything that she owned.
Police had another breakthrough in January 1999 with the discovery of Cheryl's car. It had been hidden under a cover close to her home, the same car Allen had declared stolen. Merseyside's police detective Sergeant Steve Moore examined the inside of the vehicle.
In the compartment between the front seats, he found a black bag, and that was found to contain 4 off-white in colour briquettes. One had 9.5 grams removed from it. The officer in charge of the investigation thought that this may simply be illicit drugs, but mercifully for him, he decided not to perform the usual field test for illicit drugs, because had he done so, that could have had fatal consequences for him. The main component of the briquettes was sodium cyanide, and there was sufficient there to kill up to 500 people.
Within months of returning to England, Allen had a new target. He had held back one item of jewellery stolen from Cheryl, a gold bracelet. It would turn up later on the arm of unsuspecting Jennifer Hughes.
Shortly after Cheryl's death and back in the UK, John started to schmooze a woman called Jennifer Hughes, who also happened to be a close friend of Cheryl's, and the two even played golf together. Jennifer Hughes ticked all the right boxes for John. She was well off, independent financially, and he made a beeline for her in every sense of the word.
He had also approached her with a view to going on holiday with him. And there was concern that this was in the build-up to at least have the potential to be another fatal incident.
Police moved in and arrested Allen. In January 2000, John Allen stood trial at Liverpool Central Court for the murder of Cheryl Lewis. Circumstantial evidence was piling up against him. But one crucial piece would deal a blow to the prosecution. A cyanide reading in Cheryl's body had been miscalculated.
My heart sank. It was a huge blow. It meant that one of the key areas of the circumstantial evidence had to be disregarded after a week's worth of evidence. But then again, one kept asking oneself, if it wasn't a cyanide poisoning, what was it? And all of these other factors, particularly the signs and symptoms at death, there was no other explanation, really. It made us very anxious.
The 7-week trial became one of Liverpool's longest running. Despite the setback, the culmination of other evidence was overwhelming. On the 8th of March 2000, John Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
John Allen was driven on by his own selfish desires for money, companionship, and even believed that he would never be caught.
While justice had finally been obtained for Cheryl, the aching void left by her premature death lingered for her family.
Her father is an extremely nice man, a thorough gentleman, and he was devastated by what had happened, and of course felt very badly towards John Allen and the way John Allen had behaved, but totally devastated and getting on in years, and I felt very sorry for him.
When the emergency room at a hospital in Raleigh received Eric Miller for the second time in a month, the cause of his illness was identified. To the horror of his family and medical staff, results showed his body was teeming with arsenic. The only person who wasn't shocked was his wife, Anne.
It's kind of the height of cruelty. I mean, here you got a person you're supposed to love and honor, and then here he's helpless, not realizing what you're doing.
Ann Miller suffers from malignant narcissism that has morphed into full-blown psychopathia. She is a psychopath.
Eric and Anne Miller were two brilliant, athletic and charming biochemists, destined for great things.
Her father was a very successful person in the agriculture implements business, and her mother was a school teacher. She had a very, I'd say, overly supportive growing up period there. Eric Miller came from another very good home. People were very devout Catholics, did not talk it, but very much lived their faith. And he had two older sisters who were very pleased to help raise Eric.
The academically gifted couple met while studying at Purdue University and later married. Nicknamed Ken and Barbie by their friends, they moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, to complete their masters. Anne later obtained a position at the pharmaceutical firm GlaxoSmithKline. Eric, meanwhile, studied for a PhD and became a researcher at UNC Hospital, working to find a cure for children with AIDS.
It was also a very meaningful goal wasn't a very remunerative goal. He didn't make a lot of money. And that was one of the aspects that Ann constantly complained, because she made more money than he did, even though she only had a master's and he had the doctorate in biochemistry.
Settled in Raleigh, Ann and Eric were both active in the church, even teaching a marriage preparation course in 1999. A young Raleigh police officer and his fiancée were among the group.
One of the things that the guy said was, because Ann was pregnant at this time, they said he was just delirious. He was so happy. He was going to have a child, and that everything was focused on that. He said, I've got to continue with my work, but not at the expense of spending time with my child once he or she's born. Ann, on the other hand, she was much more concerned with something that she mentioned on several occasions. She has no Ann time. Because it just seemed, prophetic.
In January 2000, Eric and Ann welcomed daughter Claire into the world. Eric was ecstatic and a devoted hands-on dad.
Eric was just completely devoted to this child, and Ann just didn't seem, that much. Ann always supposedly had meetings she had to go to, so Eric was doing a lot of child care, a lot of babysitting, so it was just kind of surprising that Ann didn't appreciate that and try to keep that going, but she obviously didn't.
Within months of becoming a mother, Ann was having an affair with a colleague, 37-year-old married father, Daryl Willard. Even more devastatingly, she was plotting her own husband's murder and had convinced Willard to help her.
And a woman had caused him to do an awful thing, notably to give Eric Miller poison on the promise from her, well, if we just get rid of Eric, you and I can be together. And I know that based on the fact that he told his wife, the mother of his child, this isn't working out, I'm gonna be leaving you soon.
Her murder weapon would be an arsenic-based cleaning agent used at her workplace.
In Ann's laboratory at GlaxoSmithKline, where she worked every day and had unlimited access, Ann had arsenic in large quantities, which was used essentially like dish detergent, because it was one of the few things that would kill the protein crystals on the lab glassware that they reused to conduct various experiments. And there was no tracking of who took how much or where it went.
In November 2000, Ann Miller picked her moment. A social event with work colleagues at a bowling alley, to which Eric was invited.
First couple of weeks in November, he had gone out bowling with some friends of his wife's.
Among them was Daryl Willard, Ann's lover, and now partner in crime.
Eric had become violently ill. To the point where he was throwing up into a trash can. And Eric made it home that night, but as time wore on, his symptoms became more and more serious. Terrible gastric distress, feeling like a super flu had overtaken him all of a sudden.
Eric asked Ann to drive him to Rex Hospital, close to their home. Rushed into the emergency room, he remained in hospital for a further 2 weeks.
Nobody was really able to diagnose his symptoms. Nothing really suggested itself that would explain why such an apparently healthy young man had become so gravely ill in such a short period of time. After he spent several days at Rex, he was transferred to UNC Hospital and put in intensive care over there. for a period of several more days. He was near death on several occasions.
Eric's fiercely strange symptoms triggered a thought in one of the doctors treating him.
This particular physician, Dr. Bill Berry, went back to one of his medical school textbooks, and when he looked up Eric's symptoms, extreme fatigue, extreme gastric distress, heart failure, multi-organ failure simultaneously, lots of things that could possibly cause this. But one of the things that stood out to Dr. Berry was heavy metals poisoning, things such as thallium and arsenic. And to that end, Dr. Berry requested a test of Eric's blood while he was still at Rex Hospital.
While the hospital waited for the results, Eric's parents had travelled from Indiana to tend to their son and help Anne mind their granddaughter. Having been at death's door, Eric made a remarkable recovery and was even able to return home in time for Thanksgiving with his family.
His strength improved. He started to be able to take short walks around the cul-de-sac that he lived on. He regained his appetite. Everything looked to be moving in the right direction.
One evening, after spending days indoors, helping their son and babysitting Claire, Eric's parents decided to venture out.
The parents go out a Friday night to go to dinner in Raleigh, and Eric and Anne are left there alone.
While the couple were putting up Christmas decorations, Anne made another attempt on Eric's life.
The people from the church had been bringing in food, and they had a refrigerator virtually full of casseroles and food that had been brought in. Anne heats up some chicken and rice casserole, gives it to him for dinner. Later that night, Eric becomes once again deathly ill. Same symptoms. And Eric just starts going downhill. He gets taken back to Rex Hospital.
On December 1st, 2000, staff at Rex Hospital received disturbing news. Test results taken from his previous stay revealed Eric Miller had been poisoned with arsenic. But who would want to harm a kind-hearted humanitarian? The hospital alerted the police, who dispatched the nearest patrolman to Eric's ward.
He's a uniformed patrol officer. He doesn't know anything about the case. He just knows we got a guy here who may have been poisoned by arsenic, and we need to file a report and get an investigation started. He manages to get Eric in a lucid enough moment where he asks him the question. The hospital says you've been poisoned. Do you have any idea who would have poisoned you? And Eric says, no, I have no idea who could have poisoned me.
Just hours later, doctors presented Eric's parents with the unfathomable news. At 2:50 a.m. on December 2nd, 2000, Eric Miller was pronounced dead. He was 30 years old.
Eric's father and mother are out there at Rex Hospital when he dies. And they have all kinds of questions for everybody, and nobody can give him any answers.
It was Lieutenant Chris Morgan's job, however, to find the answers. He called on forensic psychologist Dr. Michael Teague to help.
I was looking at all the possible enemies Eric could have, or anybody that would have any motivation to hurt him, much less kill him, and there was just none at all. No one would say a negative thing about Eric. In fact, everyone said positive statements. We couldn't even get a neutral statement. Everybody was just, very impressed with him. So you have to wonder about, well, who's motivated to do harm, who had access to Eric.
Detectives arrived at the hospital ward. that was now a crime scene. But there was a problem.
The room that he died in has been completely cleared and cleaned. All of the linens, all of the medical supplies have either been put in disposal containers down in the main hospital area, or the linen has been sent to the laundry. So we've got a homicide with no crime scene, or at least not a crime scene that's capable of being processed.
Anne, meanwhile, began preparing the funeral for her own murder victim. She surprised her Catholic parent-in-laws by insisting her husband's body be cremated.
In the Catholic Church, as I understand it, they frown upon cremation. And she just chose she was going to have him cremated despite his parents not wanting that happening, and despite his parents being very religious to the fact they've already gone through a murder. And Anne just keeps having little or no empathy without any acceptance of their misery.
Anne had single-handedly turned what should have been the season of joy into a period of hell. Despite killing their son and her own daughter's father, she and baby Claire joined Eric's parents in Indiana that Christmas. In Raleigh, meanwhile, police continued to narrow down the suspects.
Well, the next step is who had access to Eric Miller that could have given him the arsenic. And as I've oftentimes said, homicide investigation is always done from the inside out. You start investigating the people closest to the victim, and I distinctly remember the detective who interviewed one of the participants in the marriage preparation group wrote this down. I saw their handwritten notes. One of the things that Anne complained about was with the child coming and Eric's so busy at work and she's working all the time and they've got a house to take care of and getting ready for the baby to come, she has no Anne time. We had a big whiteboard in the office, and on that whiteboard, at the very top of it, somebody wrote in big block letters, Anne time.
Within weeks, detectives were accruing telling circumstantial evidence. Anne was becoming a person of interest.
You have to wonder about, well, who's motivated to do harm, who had access to Eric. And so again, all fingers kept pointing to Anne.
When Eric was first hospitalized as a result of the poisoning, and we find little things like Anne and Eric alone in the hospital room. Anne spent the night in the hospital room with Eric by herself. Eric's condition deteriorated. One of the things we learned while we were, Anne's lab, there were a couple of people who actually suggested that Anne may have been involved in sexual, romantic relationships with some of her co-workers.
One of the co-workers named was Daryl Willard.
January of 2001. I was instructed to assist the detective in drawing a search warrant to search Daryl Willard's home, one of the guys who had been involved in the incident in the bowling alley. I was ordered to conduct a search of evidence of arsenic, any documents indicating anything that may be relevant to Eric's murder, financial records, all kinds of things. The day after I searched his house in January of 2001, Daryl Willard went into his garage and shot himself in the head with a pistol.
When Anne returned from Indiana after Christmas, police were keen to get a statement from her.
She didn't want any contact with the police. She didn't want to send a letter, an email, or anything to the police. It was just like she just didn't want anything to do with it. And then when Anne wouldn't agree to an interview and lawyered up very fast, It really raised a lot of suspicions. Didn't really act like a grieving widow, and never once called the Raleigh Police Department and say, "Why haven't you found the person who killed my husband?" Never once.
While Anne showed little interest in the police investigation, Eric's family was desperate for news. When detectives conveyed who their prime suspect was, his family were in disbelief.
First time a detective kind of asked a question that tended to suggest that the police thought man might have done it, the sisters got really angry. Oh, really angry. And it took them a while to read all the evidence and see a different view. It just wasn't a big number of supporters of Anne. And then after Eric's family saw more and more of the evidence, they pretty much realized it was Anne as well. So it just took a long time for his family to process there. So it was really kind of shocking.
Anne surprised police by moving out of the family house she had shared with Eric. She relocated 2.5 hours south to the coastal town of Wilmington, where her sister lived. Leaving her well-paid pharmaceutical job, she became a store assistant in an interior design shop. By 2003, she had remarried, this time to Paul Kontz, a musician. Lieutenant Morgan asked his colleague, Dr. Michael Teague, to go undercover for him. His mission? To scope out Anne Miller.
I thought the lady that was helping me was the owner of the interior design business. I said, "Oh, are you Miss So-and-so," whatever the lady's name was. And she said, no, I'm Anne, just kind of her head down. And I thought, oh my God, that is Anne Miller, and I didn't recognize her. And I was just dumbfounded I didn't recognize her. And we got back in the van with the lieutenant. I said, "Lieutenant, if I didn't know what I knew about this case, I think you were the meanest man in the world bothering that poor sweet lady in that office, But she was excellent about putting on a aura, a presentation, and she was good.
That stuck with me. That's one of the true gems Teague ever dropped on me. If he thinks that, guess what? It's gonna be hard. And it was hard. Getting her to plead guilty or be convicted.
Like Eric's family, few of Morgan's colleagues could believe Anne would be capable of murder.
The big controversy, the big problem in this case, in the view of the people who were in charge of it at that time, was we don't think Anne Miller would try to poison her husband with arsenic and then use arsenic to kill him. But when I found out that Anne Miller worked around arsenic, had it like water in her lab, when I found out she'd been having affairs with multiple men while her husband lives the life, that he lived, something just stuck in my mind. This ain't right.
By 2004, Morgan had assumed the lead role on the case. The promotion coincided with an auspicious phone call from an old friend, Richard Gammon.
Rick Gammon had actually been the attorney that Darrell Willard contacted prior to his suicide, prior to me searching his house. When I said, "Rick, when are you gonna tell me what Darrell Willard told you during that phone call?" Rick says, "Well, Chris, I can't tell you that ever, unless a judge orders me to." Damn. The past 5 years or 4 years have been a really long time. I said, "This is it. That's what we need."
A court order compelled the release of Darrell Willard's admission to his attorney.
That one paragraph says, "During Eric Miller's second hospitalization, I went to Rex Hospital parking lot. Ann Miller came out and met me in the car, showed me a syringe, and told me that she had just injected her husband's IV line with poison in that syringe." Daryl said, "Why did you do that?" She said, "I don't know."
With that piece of evidence, Ann Miller was indicted for murder.
September, 6 days after I retired officially, Ann Miller turned herself in after the grand jury indictment was presented to her attorneys.
Ann's bail was set at $3 million. Her sister assumed custody of daughter Claire. Morgan received more news. Ann Miller had agreed to a plea deal.
Her lawyer says she'll plead guilty to murder in the second, conspiracy to commit murder. I said, Ann has to stand up in court and she has to say, "I killed my husband." Nothing less will do.
In November 2005, 5 years after Eric was first hospitalized with arsenic poisoning, the trial began.
2005, Ann Miller stood up in the Superior Court of Wake County. Judge Stevens asked her, "Did you kill your husband?" And she said, croakingly, "Yes." I heard it. Eric's family heard it. Nobody else needed to hear it.
You expected some type of statement, "I'm sorry." I mean, even though you probably thought it wasn't very sincere, but at least, perform a statement. Nothing. And she almost seemed like she was just, act like she really wasn't there, like she was disassociating.
The Miller family had the chance to read out a victim impact statement.
But there was a point in time where I thought I was going to have to restrain Eric's mother when they were giving the victim impact statements prior to Ann's sentencing.
And the oldest sister was very emotional and very spirited and just gave her as much as she could give her about how terrible it was that everybody felt.
His older sister, I watched her, I was about 6 feet away from her, maybe 8 feet, while she was giving her victim impact statement, standing in front of the judge and in front of Ann and her lawyers. And she was just trembling. I saw her fist. It was down by her side. She couldn't keep her arm still. And I said, "Oh, Lord, I'm gonna have to jump on this woman and hold her back if she tries to kill Ann with her bare hands."
Ann Miller was taken to the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women to serve out her sentence of 25 to 31 years. Eric's parents won secondary custody of their granddaughter Claire.
Number one, you don't kill anybody, and number two, you never kill a saint, and she sure did.